Monday morning and some hard-hitting world economic news basics. These first up is the US debt to GDP chart. It's hard to get your head round anything to do with this crisis unless you've got this chart in your mind. This particular one goes back to 1929 up to not 2008 anyway, and it represents debt to GDP for government, GSE, agency debt, financial, ABS, household and corporate debt. And obviously, yes, it sweeps up at the end, but it's good to look back at the Great Depression and see where that lies in relation to where we are now. Moving on, FT.com, the dollar fall sparks stability warnings. Now, what I'm going to do with these series this morning is mix up fiscal policy and monetary policy. And normally they're kept separate or put in different boxes, but they circulate round. Fiscal causes monetary, monetary causes fiscal. But basically the government is at the bottom of everything. That's the way to look at it, in my opinion. Dollar fall sparks stability warnings. The dollar tumbled against most major currencies on Thursday, prompting warnings that the weakness of the world's reserve currency could destabilize the global economy and push other countries into retaliatory devaluations to underwrite their exports. Increasing expectations the Federal Reserve will pump more money into the US economy next month under a policy known as quantitative easing sent the dollar to new lows against the Chinese renminbi, Swiss franc and Australian dollar. It dropped to a 15-year low against the yen and to an 8-month low against the euro. The dollar index, which tracks a basket of currencies, reached its lowest level this year. A senior European policymaker, who asked not to be named, said a further aggressive round of monetary easing, that would be QE2, by the Federal Reserve would be irresponsible, as it made US exports more competitive at the expense of its rivals. Now, I'll move on with the theme. FT.com again. The new threat to the global economy. Concerns about currency tensions are intensifying as the US trade deficit rockets and the Federal Reserve mulls another round of quantitative easing, but it's not the US and other developed countries that should be worried. That's confusing, but we'll move on. The main source of contention is currencies, in particular the value of China's renminbi. Holding down the value of currencies against market pressures, as practiced by Beijing on a huge scale, creates distortions and should be stopped. But this would treat the symptom rather than the cause. Global imbalances are largely the result of poorly coordinated macroeconomic policies. The US runs large trade deficits with European countries whose currencies float. Letting the renminbi appreciate will make little difference if countries cannot learn to cooperate better on other economic policies. This is too difficult for me to explain it, but it's something that needs to be in people's heads if they're going to get anywhere close to understanding what is coming down on them. Last paragraph on this one. With the US unable to rely on foreign demand and Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke publicly flirting with an explicit inflation target, further monetary easing seems likely. The prospect has sent the dollar plummeting this week against most major currencies. There could be yet further falls if QE is stepped up, accelerating the flight from the dollar. It's a fight. FT.com, third one. Via Reuters this time, Trichet says the Eurozone needs stricter fiscal reforms. Now, we've hopped over to Europe, and in a way, we're talking more fiscal policy than monetary policy. But it's all interlinked, and that's what's so crucial. In Marrakesh, Morocco, European Central Bank President Jean-Claude Trichet said on Saturday that more ambitious reforms of the Eurozone budget rules were needed than those proposed by the European Commission. This is the European Central Bank talking about the European Commission, who are a bunch of idiots, non-elected twits that are meant to be doing things. Trichet's comments add further fuel to a debate over European Union fiscal reforms ahead of a meeting of European finance ministers on Monday, today, in Luxembourg to complete the biggest overhaul of the fiscal rules underpinning the euro since the single currency's creation in 1999. They know that huge things have gone wrong and they're going to try and retro-fix it. Not a chance. The ministers will seek to agree on a report for EU leaders on how to make the rules tougher to prevent another sovereign debt crisis such as that was triggered by Greece. This is classic shutting the stable door after the horse is well over the fields and far away. Bloomberg. Trichet says overwhelming majority of ECB Council backs bond purchases. I'll read and then maybe comment. European Central Bank President Jean-Claude Trichet, he that was in Morocco, rebuffed Bundesbank President Axel Weber his call to terminate bond purchase programme, saying that the overwhelming majority of the bank's 22-member governing council still backs the buys. In other words, want to carry on with the policy. Asked in an interview with the Italian newspaper La Stampa whether the programme didn't work and should be scrapped, he responded, "No, no, this is not the position of the governing council with an overwhelming majority." In other words, again, we are going to push forward with these buying of Greek and Irish bonds, and Portugal and Spanish and Italian and anybody that gets into trouble. Weber, who also sits on the ECB's decision-making council, said on October the 13th, over in the United States, I think, that bond purchase program should be stopped. Typical German. The remarks, the strongest from any ECB official advocating a removal of stimulus, came as governments and banks in Ireland, Portugal and Greece struggled to convince investors that they can fix their budgets and balance sheets in the aftermath of this year's sovereign debt crisis. What Trichet is really saying here is trying to slap down the Germans, who, if people listen to them, the euro would go even higher against the dollar. What Trichet is trying to do is jawbone down the euro, but he's going to have to crank up the buying of euro bonds to balance out what Bernanke's doing on the other side of the Atlantic, because European exporters don't want an expensive euro. Calculated risk, back in the States, the Fed's Evans suggests a price level target. This is Chicago Fed President Charles Evans. There are quite a number of academic studies of liquidity trap crises that find either price level targeting or temporary above average inflation to be nearly optimum policies. In other words, Evans is saying that we want to not just go for the 2% inflation, we might have to aim for 4 or 5% to get out of the liquidity trap that could be gurgling in front of us. Calculated risk again. Fed's Rosengren, who's the Boston Fed president, says, from a policy perspective, I take several lessons from the Japanese experience. First, should deflation occur, it can be quite difficult to overcome. Again, fearing this whirlpool ahead of them, they'll do anything not to get there. So insuring against the risk of deflation may be much cheaper than waiting until it has occurred. In other words, we'll do anything not to go into the gurgly whirlpool of deflation. And I'll finish with the New York Times. And world trade, once rising, is starting to sag again. The rapid recovery in world trade after the financial crisis appears to have slowed this spring and summer, raising new concerns about the global economy. Exports of many countries have stabilized at levels well under the peaks reached before the crisis sent the world trade into a tailspin. In other words, the real economy, what we'd call the real economy, we don't understand all this money stuff and fiscal stuff, but the real economy is still in the dumps. And it's a horrible balancing act that these people have got to try and play if they want to pull and push levers to try and get what going. Fiscal policy right, monetary policy right, real world economy right, employment right, exports right, deficit right. It's damn near impossible. And the follow-up for the New York Times are the charts that show the export levels of countries: United States, Canada, Mexico, Brazil; in Asia, China, India, South Korea and Taiwan; and in Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Greece, Poland, Russia and Spain. So you can get a grip of how they're doing on their exports compared to where they were before the crisis. It's still jolly bad and so complex, all this, that the mere brains of the people in charge have got not a chance of working out what is to do for the best. So they'll do things, but they're almost guaranteed to be wrong and will make things worse. Have a good week. Bye.